Thank you, John, and thank you, Carol, very, very much indeed for the invitation to speak, and also, of course, for the kind introduction. It is a great, great pleasure to be here, and thank you to you all for tuning in as well. Now, it's a great sadness, I think, for us all not to be able to meet as part of the BSA's traditional summer garden party activities, and I'm not quite sure how much an online lecture can make up for a missed garden party. So I very much hope that you do all have a glass of something in your hand to accompany this lecture. I know I do, although I've promised John faithfully that it's only water, as it might help us all go some way to recapturing our lost summer garden party experience. Now, in some ways, the period of time I want to talk with you about this evening has the feeling of an end of summer garden party. That time when the last few late warm evenings are being enjoyed in spite of the tightening grip of autumn. Now, that time for us this evening is Greece under the Roman Empire, from the late 1st century BCE through to the mid 2nd century CE. Now, many of you will no doubt immediately throw up your arms in horror at such a characterization of Greece under the Roman Empire as a sort of end of summer garden party. And ultimately, never fear, this evening, my plan is to agree with you. But I think it is hard initially to escape such an impression. We're all too familiar with the Roman depictions of Greece as a place of cultural and artistic inspiration. Just have a look at the infamous quotes from Horace: "Captive Greece captured her uncouth conqueror, Rome, and brought her arts to rustic Latium." Or as Pliny has it in his epistles, "Remember that you have been sent to the province of Achaia, to the pure and genuine Greece, where civilization and literature and agriculture too are believed to have originated." Such an impression of a place of cultural importance for the development of civilization also comes through in later writers like Pausanias, who in the 2nd century CE was keen to underline, as he wrote his sort of early rough guide, if you like, tour of Greece, the religious historicity as well as the current religious vitality and unity of the region. Now, this sense of Greece as a container of key cultural and artistic creations of the past runs also through one of my favorite texts from this period, Strabo's 1st century CE geography, describing the entire known world at the time, as he talks about it, the oikoumene. Now, it's been noted by scholars, and we can get a sense of what Strabo's worldview was from this map created to reflect his text. And it's been noted by scholars that Strabo's description of Greece, which is in books 8 to 9 of his 17-book tour of the entire known world, contains more references to artworks, poetry, monuments, and sanctuaries than any other part of the geography. Greece is, if nothing else, full of such works, more so, presumably, in Strabo's eyes, than anywhere else worth mentioning in the world. But simultaneously, despite this acknowledgement of Greece's past achievements and thus its current cultural glories on display, the impression is also given of Greece as a much less interesting, let alone powerful part of the oikoumene in Strabo's own time. Back in 1980, Baladier wrote, for instance, in reference to Strabo's description of Greece in his books 8 to 9, that these have been thought of to be the least interesting in the geography. Or as Maria Pretzler has recently commented in 2005, much of books 8 to 9 seems scarcely more than an attempt to describe the Homeric landscape and bring it up to date. Indeed, as we work through Strabo's geography, we realize that he actively marginalizes the place in his tour around the inhabited world. Strabo's choice of route as he tours the oikoumene physically leaves Greece out on a limb. His narrative structure takes him from the Pillars of Hercules in the west across Europe to Italy before moving on to the remaining eastern countries, as he describes it, and then it leaves on the right the whole of Thrace, Illyria, lastly Finally, Greece. And this marginalization is underlined, indeed it's only made possible, by Strabo's choice first to describe the seaboard all the way to Byzantium, Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, before returning to describe the limb of Greece left hanging below. Strabo, by his own narrative structure, makes Greece a marginal space, even of the Mediterranean world. Now, this is not to say by any means that Greece is entirely without importance to Strabo's construction of his oikumene in the 1st century CE. Indeed, Strabo insists at the outset that the world has been discovered by 4 principal players: Alexander the Great, the Romans, the Parthians, and Mithridates, in which Alexander was responsible for opening up a great part of Asia and all the northern parts of Europe. In books 11 to 17 of the geography, which cover Asia Minor, the Middle East, and North Africa, there's also a reoccurring focus on Greek myths, events, historical figures as key elements that have shaped the space, history, and place of these countries within the oikumene. So it might be the use of myths of Jason, Medea and the Golden Fleece, for example, as well as that of the Amazons, the Trojan War, and of course, the historical conquests of Alexander the Great. Now, Greece also dominates not just the space of the oikumene, but also its sense of time, according to Strabo. In fact, Strabo hangs his world narrative around 3 key moments: the Trojan War, the return of the Heraclidae to the Peloponnese, and the Battle of Actium, 2 mythical Greek events and 1 event that actually took place in Greece. So overall then, we get a sense from Strabo of Greece as a place historically important to the construction and discovery of the known world, but one which, in Strabo's day, is itself a marginal locality stuffed with the material of the past. Now, I do not want this evening to rehearse the many different ways in which we might counteract this impression of life in Greece itself from the 1st century CE onwards, which has been ably done by others in reference to Greece's literary outputs of the period, or the continuing activity of its polis, the vibrancy and importance of its many sanctuaries, festivals and games, or indeed by the actions of particular Roman emperors, like Hadrian, to reform Greece in his Pan-Hellenion in order for it to play a more powerful role within the Roman world. What interests me today is the way in which Greece was actively involved around Strabo's own time with the Mediterranean's participation in this ever-growing oikumene. Now, at the time Strabo was writing, Roman ships were setting out from the Egyptian ports of Berenice and Myos down through the Arabian Gulf, out into the Indian Ocean, and using the monsoon winds to sail directly across that ocean to the main trading ports of India, places like Barbaricum, Baragaza, Xeris, Pondicherry, on an annual basis, bringing back with them enormous quantities of luxury goods, which were then, of course, taxed several times by the Roman authorities, resulting in a massive increase in funds in the Roman state treasury. Goods were also coming in through the emerging land routes of the later Silk Roads, through caravan cities like Palmyra on the Romano-Parthian border, as well as via land and sea routes further to the north, entering the Mediterranean via the Black Sea. Chinese silks, we know, were being rewoven at places like Tyre and Alexandria, marked on this map for you, to create the thin, translucent weaves that Roman women were wearing with gusto, and which were giving writers like Pliny and Seneca at the time heart attacks over the slipping of Roman moral decency. Wines from across the Mediterranean were being specifically demanded, we hear in the sources, by Indian kings. Roman traders were beginning to make their way not only to the eastern Indian trading ports, places like Pojica, modern Pondicherry, but into areas like modern-day Vietnam, and even, according to the Chinese sources, by the second half of the 2nd century CE, potentially into the presence of the Chinese emperor. Now, within this quickly expanding world, what was the view from the Aegean. We've seen how Strabo articulates his exploration of some parts of this new world, the Oikoumene, as well as his chronological compass, via key Greek myths and Greek historical figures and events. But what role did Greece and Greeks play in this fast developing network of trade and cultural awareness in Strabo's own time? What understanding did Greeks in Greece have of this much wider world? And this is a question that I find often gets left out of discussions of the development of the early Silk Roads, as exemplified, I think, by this map that you're looking at, which marks out the main key routes through which trade and traders were beginning to move. You'll notice the Roman Via Egnatia up in northern Greece. Greece seems to be completely left out of this model. Now, the first of these questions, what role did Greece and Greeks play in the fast developing global networks of trade, I think is in some ways easier to answer and to get our heads around. Not surprisingly, given the conquests of Alexander the Great back in the 4th century BCE and the development of the subsequent Seleucid dynasty and its empire from the 4th to the 1st centuries BCE, Greek culture, art, monuments, ideas, and influence were interwoven with local traditions and cultures across a vast geographical expanse, reaching deep into Central Asia. Indeed, some have recently claimed that Greek artistic influence may have spread as far as China itself, although you'd be hard-pressed to find somebody in China willing to accept that. Yet more concretely, we know that Greeks were actively living and working on the land-based Silk Road trading networks in the 1st century CE. In 19 CE, for instance, we know that Greek merchants were living alongside merchants from Palmyra as a community in Seleucia on the Tigris, founded as a Seleucid commercial trading center, and by this time part of the Parthian Empire, a place some 700 kilometers or so from the Roman border community at Zeugma up on this map and sort of near Edessa up in the top left corner. Trade came to Seleucia along the old Persian royal road connecting Ecbatana and Central Asia and could be sent west via the Euphrates, crossing at Geropos or further north at Zeugma. Now, alongside these Greeks sitting on parts of the Silk Road distinctly outside of the Mediterranean world, we also hear of the curious case of Mace, who is also called Titianus, a Macedonian and a merchant like his father, according to Ptolemy, who sent his trading agents, overland deep into Central Asia to the Stone Tower around about 100 CE, and who later wrote an account of this trading venture, giving, as Ptolemy put it, the measurement of Asia which he had obtained, not by visiting the Seres, silk people, the Chinese, in person, but by sending out agents who actually met them. Now, many elements of this story are unclear, beginning with where Mace was from. Ptolemy calls him a Macedonian, although this may mean a Macedonian from Greece, or as some scholars have argued, given that Mace is a Semitic name, that he was a Syrian and held citizenship of one of the Greek cities of Syria, or perhaps even given his title, Titianus, that his family had Roman citizenship through the patronage of someone called Titius. The destination of his trading agents is also up for discussion. The Stone Tower seems to have been in the Pamir mountain range, perhaps Tashkurgan, marked on this map, now some 3,000 kilometers east of Seleucia, where those Greeks were living back in 19 CE. Now, as scholars have pointed out, this was a very unusual long-distance trading venture, not least because most goods were moved along the Silk Roads actually by traders operating only over relatively short distances, then buying and selling and handing those goods over to another group who would travel another short distance. Very rarely did people go themselves over such long distances, and it was probably only possible around this time, around about 100 CE, because of a rare set of political and military détentes, both in the West, between Rome and Parthia, and in the east, following the Chinese Han pacification of the Tarim Basin area as it expanded into the Western regions, Central Asia, opening up the possibility for a continuous journey by one group across such a vast distance. Now, at the stone tower, we heard that Mace's agents, according to Ptolemy, met with the Seres, the Chinese, who we know were in this region following the pacification of the Tarim Basin under the famous Chinese Han general Ban Chao. Now, from the Chinese sources around this time, we hear that around about 100 CE, Ban Chao sent his son back to the Chinese emperor to ask for permission to retire, and that he sent with his son representatives from a distant land called Meng Qi et Tu Le, according to the Guhan Shu, the Chinese chronicle. Now, scholars have argued that this could be a phonic fit for Macedonian, or perhaps even for the name of Maius Titianus. These representatives, we hear in the Chinese sources, came before the emperor, offered silks and the gold seal of their king, sort of golden Roman coins, and were taken by the Chinese emperor to be a diplomatic mission from the ruler of these lands, rather than a trading mission. So whatever the truth and detail about Maius, also called Titianus, these single case studies, I think, give us some sense of the activities of the Greeks spread out across the vast network of trade that would become the Silk Roads. But what about closer to home, right? What perceptions and understandings of this ever increasingly connected world could be felt in Greece in this period from the late 1st century BCE through to the mid-2nd century CE? Now, Greece was, of course, well aware of the worlds conquered and or engaged with by Alexander the Great, some of which, of course, as we well know, had been discussed by writers like Herodotus long before Alexander. And over the following centuries, as part of the Hellenistic world, Greece became familiar with all sorts of exotic goods that came from further afield, as well as with traders from the furthest reaches of the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, as early as the mid-3rd century BCE, we hear that merchants working from Delos were complaining that the market for African elephant ivory had become so saturated with product that there was now a steep fall in prices. And in the middle 2nd century BCE, Minoan merchants based in Egypt near the Red Sea, and who were involved in the trade of incense coming up from Arabia via Egypt into the Mediterranean, that these people were also operating on Delos and making dedications there in the sanctuary of Artemis. And in this, we're reminded that actually there's been a temple of the Egyptian god Isis in the Piraeus in Athens for Egyptian traders putting into port there for trade from at least the late 4th century BC onwards. But if we dial forward into the period that we're concerned with this evening, to the 1st century CE, and we move to Qana in southern Arabia, we find a smashed palmyrene container on the floor of a storage room. Now, once reassembled, this container was found to bear an inscription that was added before the container was fired in palmyrene script, reading Achaia. In addition, a larger monogram L was painted onto the vessel. Now, while it's impossible to know for sure how to understand this piece, it's potentially evident that palmyrene traders were either trading goods via Arabia, coming directly from the Roman province of Achaia, that's the Peloponnese, Attica, Boeotia, Euboea, and Cyclades, or, as other scholars have argued, that they were in fact taking orders from merchants in Achaia, in Greece, with the container marked as to its destination. If so, it becomes emblematic of the degree to which Greek merchants operating from central Greece understood the trading opportunities of the wider world of which they were a small part. Now, that Greek merchants operating from the Roman province of Achaia, and indeed from the neighbouring Roman provinces of Epirus and Macedonia, were actively aware of and engaged with this burgeoning trading network is no surprise when we remember quite how close to the main trading routes to and from the Mediterranean and the East passed through and by Greece. We already mentioned the Via Egnatia, completed in the 2nd century BCE as an extension of the Appian Way back in Italy, and we see here in this slide how it wound through Illyricum, Macedonia, and Thrace, through on to Byzantium, Constantinople, and of course acted as a major artery for east-west trade, the movement of people as well as troops. But central Greece, and the Peloponnese, so the Roman province of Achaia, following its creation in 31 BC, was also in close contact with major east-west sea trade routes. Now, while goods coming up from India were passed up from the Red Sea port of Via Egnatia to Alexandria, and from there distributed across the Mediterranean, and other goods arriving to the Mediterranean across land via Palmyra and Zeugma might be exported to Tyre and Antioch, there was also a northerly land route which came to the Caspian Sea, thence to the Phasis River in Colchis, and to the coastal town of Dioscurias on the Black Sea, which is modern Sukhumi in Georgia. Now, these routes coming up and over via the Caspian Sea to the Black Sea had been explored by Pompey, and they're described for us by the ancient writers Strabo and Pliny. Both speak of Dioscurias as a thriving trading town in which 300 tribes speaking different languages came to buy and sell their goods, requiring a team of 130 interpreters in order for the Mediterranean trading merchants to get on with their trade. Strabo talks about the way that Dioscurias was just 2 or 3 days sailing max from the Greek colonial settlements, again marked on the map of Amisus and Sinope on the southern Black Sea coast, from where merchants would easily then and often load ships to travel down through the Bosphorus, the Sea of Marmara and the Hellespont, and across the Aegean, destined for different trading ports across the Mediterranean. Now, one of the ports these vessels, and no doubt other vessels coming from places like Tyre and Antioch, or indeed up from Alexandria, were destined for, was Corinth. Corinth, of course, has a long history as a crucial trading centre, controlling the isthmus with its dual ports of Lycaon and Cancrai. Now, during the Roman period, following its destruction in 146 BCE and its refounding as a Roman colony, it became an ever increasingly busy banking and trading hub, linking trade between Italy and the East, as well as, of course, between Italy and the Roman provinces of Greece. It's instructive here, I think, that Strabo, back in that geography of the known world, the Oikumene in the 1st century CE, describes Corinth as being in the ideal position for a trading port connecting Italy and Asia. And it was, of course, to Corinth that famous figures like St. Paul travelled as part of his tour through Greece, and where he subsequently stayed for 18 months in 51 to 2 CE before sailing on to Ephesus. And it's notable also that in his correspondence with the Corinthians, Paul at one point underlines the fact that he's not like the rest of the throng gathered at Corinth. For I am not like those who hawk the word of God in the marketplace, but I speak out of sincerity as one sent from God, standing before God in Christ. Now that same concern to stand out from the rest of the crowd passing through Corinth is visible in the writings of another visitor to Corinth just some 60 or 70 years later. In the second quarter, the 2nd century CE, Favorinus, a Roman citizen from Gaul, not to mention a travelling hermaphroditic sophist, made his 3rd visit to Corinth and spoke to the Corinthians to complain about the loss of the statue that they had put up of him in front of the city's library after his 2nd visit. For you, Corinthians, honoured me thus, not as one among the many that each season put in a Cancrai, trader, or spectator, or ambassador, or traveller, but as a beloved friend who made an appearance with great difficulty after a long absence. Now, this vision of Corinth as at the crossroads of worlds is echoed also in the near contemporary mid-2nd century CE writings of the orator Aelius Aristides, who praised Corinth to the rooftops. For it, Corinth is, as it were, a kind of marketplace, and at that, common to all the Greeks. It's a national festival, not like this present one, which the Greek race celebrates here every 2 years, the Isthmian Games, but one which is celebrated every year and daily. For it receives all cities and sends them off again and is a common refuge for all, like a kind of route and passage for all mankind, no matter where one would travel. And it is a common city for all the Greeks, indeed, as it were, a kind of metropolis and mother city in this respect. And he goes on to say, indeed, you would see it everywhere, full of wealth and an abundance of goods, as much as is likely, since the earth on every side and the sea on every side flooded with these, as if it dwelled in the midst of its goods and was washed all around them, like a merchant ship. Now, this picture of Corinth, and more widely of Greece, as an absolutely key central crossroads in the wider trading networks that were ever expanding into what would become Silk Roads, I think also is reflected in one of my favourite pastimes, which is playing with the maps on Orbis, the Stanford geospatial modelling of travel around the Mediterranean world. And it's here I think, that we start to see just how well connected in Corinth was, both to the local coastal trading routes and indeed to the open sea routes as well. And if we see not just this map detailing all the routes via Corinth, but this map, which shows the flow and activity levels of the different routes coming to and from Corinth, we start to get an impression of its importance. So against this background of Greece and Greek knowledge of and interactions with and receptions of goods and people moving across the Mediterranean world and in turn coming from a much wider world, we also hear of key moments, in fact, very early on in the period in question, when that much wider ancient world was brought face to face with the Greeks themselves within their own cities, indeed leaving a permanent marker of that interaction in Greece itself to be seen by later generations. I'm talking about the time of the Emperor Augustus. Now, he visited Greece several times after his military victories, concerned with putting Greece back on its feet after the difficult years following the destruction of Corinth, as we've seen back in 146 BCE. He distributed corn to Greek cities, he initiated a remission of debts, he encouraged the Greek cities to develop, to be able to stand on their own 2 feet, whether that was Athens, playing off its old world culture, Patrai with its developing flax industry, or Corinth, as we've seen, as a trading hub. And he was in Corinth in 29 BCE. But in 26 BCE, we hear that envoys came to meet Augustus from much further away. These envoys came from the Saca king in India. Now, according to Suetonius, these ambassadors were from nations previously known to us only through hearsay. This is the very beginning of the period of the Roman trading fleet opening up and making their journeys across the Indian Ocean with monsoon winds. They came with Augustus. They came to Augustus, where they petitioned the king for the friendship of Augustus and the Roman people. And in doing so, supposedly, these envoys from the Saca king in India compared his achievements to the glories of Alexander the Great. Now, these envoys most likely came on behalf of one King Azes, the last Saca king to rule in Indo-Scythia, bordering on the Parthian Empire, controlling the port, as you can see labelled there with the arrow of Baragaza, which would, as we've seen, by the 1st century CE, become a major destination for Roman trading ships sailing from Roman Egypt. Now, it's been argued that Azes was looking for an ally in the fight against Parthia and thought that the Romans on the other side of the Parthian Empire would do very nicely. And given that Azes seems to have been an eager engager with Greek culture, he had the goddess Athena on his coins, for instance, we can understand why he might have chosen to use the references to Alexander the Great in his mission that he sent to Augustus. But this happened in Spain. So what does it have to do with Greece? Well, King Azes sent a second set of Saca ambassadors who came to the Mediterranean just a few years later in 22 to 20 BCE. This time, they seem to have travelled overland through Roman Syria and were seen arriving at Antioch, where they were received by the Roman authorities and were then taken on to the Greek island Samos in 21 BCE, where Augustus was at the time receiving a great many embassies. Now, Augustus had at this point travelled through Sparta, Athens, been overwintered over at Samos, then been into Bithynia and Syria, and now returned to winter a second time on Samos, and that's when the ambassadors finally catch up with him. We're told that only 3 of the original group of Saca ambassadors survived the journey to meet with Augustus. The ambassadors carried with them a letter from Azes written in Greek on a vellum scroll, which detailed the number of minor kingdoms under his control in northern India, also outlining that he was anxious for an alliance with Caesar Augustus. Given the Parthian threat, he suggested an alliance similar to that which had been struck between Alexander the Great and the Indian king Porus, and that Azes was totally happy to allow Augustus passage through his country wherever he wished to proceed and cooperate with him in anything that was honourable. The result of this was supposedly a further treaty of friendship between Augustus and Azes, but although principally because Augustus had already begun to seek peace with Parthians, it never progressed further to any kind of military alliance. Now, what's important for us is that this encounter happened in the Greek world, first on the island of Samos, but then moving through to Athens, as Augustus moved across Greece in 2120 BC with the Saca ambassadors in tow. Not only the ambassadors either, but also the gifts that they had brought with them for the emperor from Azes. And it's in Strabo that we hear an account of those gifts, alongside also the ancient writer Dio Cassius. Strabo tells us that a friend of his, Nicolaus, actually saw both the treaty and the gifts, and that Strabo had himself seen the gifts as well. They were supposedly presented by 8 naked servants clad only in loincloths, and included a youth who had no arms, but was instead dubbed by the Greeks as a living Hermes, due to his similarity to the Greek Herm statues. This youth, according to Dio Cassius, uses his feet as if they were hands, and with them he could pull a bow, shoot missiles, and put a trumpet to his lips. Now, scholars have argued that Azes was probably not unaware of the potentiality for his Mediterranean and particularly Greek audience to make this connection to Hermes, because he had accompanied the youth with gifts of, we're again told, a partridge larger than a vulture, a large tortoise, as well as a group of colourful Indian snakes and a giant python, about 1,000,000 miles from the tortoise, rooster, and stark-with snakes often associated with Hermes. Now, Dio Cassius claims also that Azes sent tigers as part of this gift package, and that this was the first time that Romans and probably the Greeks had seen these animals. We can be sure then that as Augustus toured from Samos, and particularly as he came to Athens in 2120 BC, accompanied by the Saca ambassadors, the armless youth, these gifts, these animals perhaps never seen before, he would have made quite a splash, and that the Greeks coming to see him and them would have been very much amazed. They would have been amazed, I think, by another member of the Saca party that we're told came with Augustus to Athens, an Indian holy man who in the Mediterranean sources is known as Zamaras. Now, this is potentially a Greek rendition of the Sanskrit term Sharama, describing a Buddhist or a Jain or a holy man. And while in Athens, we hear from the Dio Cassius that he relates that Augustus was initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries, which were held out of season, especially for him, and he seems to have invited Zamaras to be initiated into the cult as well. Following this, Zamaras seems to have requested permission to demonstrate his faith, which Augustus permitted. The gathered crowds in Athens, we're told by the ancient sources, thus watched, as did the Emperor Augustus, as Zamaras anointed his naked body with fragrances, and wearing only a loincloth, leaped upon a lighted pyre with a laugh. Watching this man set himself on fire and burn himself to death seems to have created no little bemusement. And here Strabo and Dio Cassius offer us a series of different explanations for why perhaps Zamaras went on to do this. This is the practice with persons in distress, Strabo starts out, who seek escape from existing calamities. and with others, as was the case with this man, for as everything hitherto had succeeded with him, he thought it necessary to depart, lest some unexpected calamity should happen to him by continuing to live. With a smile, therefore, naked, anointed, and with the girdle around his waist, he leaped upon the pyre. Or, as Cassius has it, one of the Indians, Zamaris, for some reason wished to die, either because, being of the caste of sages, he was on this account moved by ambition, or in accordance with the traditional custom of the Indians because of old age, or because he wished to make a display for the benefit of Augustus and the Athenians. Now, Augustus, we're told, subsequently organized for the cremated remains to be placed in a tomb at Athens, on which we hear from the sources was inscribed, "Here lies Zamanochagas, an Indian from Baragaza, who immolated himself in accordance with his ancestral customs." The fact that this remained a famous and well-known tomb in Athens is evidenced by Plutarch, who, writing at the very end of the 1st century CE, beginning of the 2nd century CE, commented that they still show you the Indian's monument who had performed the same ritual when he came with Caesar to Athens, as an Indian called Calanus, who had been an advisor to Alexander the Great, had done in front of Alexander the Great and his Macedonian army back in the 4th century BCE. Now, no doubt, Augustus was very proud to receive and to show off the embassies that came to him from such far-flung lands, whereas Alexander the Great had had to conquer his way there to receive such treaties of friendship. The Indian kings now came to him, and it's a point Augustus makes in his own Res Gestae. To me were sent embassies of kings from India who had never been seen in the camp of any Roman general. So the view from the Aegean, then, that I want to offer you this evening is of a much bigger global ancient world, and perhaps, for Greece's perspective, much more complex than it first appears. No doubt Romans came to Greece during this period looking for the Disneyland, the finishing school experience of rhetorical and philosophical training, in Athens in particular, alongside a hearty dash of being inspired by the Spartan military example of old, and considered Greece as a place of historical value, but of little current importance, that initial impression we had from Strabo. It was a place whose history was important for understanding the world, but not necessarily still one which impacted upon it. Yet what I hope you'll take away from this evening is that Greece's geographical location between Italy and Asia, its own long-standing trading, political and cultural connections stretching deep into Asia and India, not to mention its facilitation of and interaction with the trading arteries of the Mediterranean that connected into those of the Silk Roads, meant that Greece and those living there continued to have a very sophisticated view of the wider ancient world, the oikoumene, and continued to be actively involved in trading with it, and on occasion, they saw that wider ancient world come to Greece itself, leaving not only bemusement at the time, but a permanent marker in Greece's landscape in the form of the Indian's monument. Now, in many ways, I think that our misconception of Greece's position within the Roman world and vis-a-vis the much wider global ancient world has a lot of overlap with the position modern Greece finds itself in today. And I want to take just a few minutes now to mark out that modern day position. We're all familiar with the difficulties that Greece has in particular been through in the last decade, and the resulting often unfair caricatures that have been formulated of it as a historically important, politically and financially marginal part of Europe. And yet, when I went to China last in 2018, I was fascinated to find greeting me at the airport this image, which suggests that to others, Greece is perhaps much, much more. Cultural gateway, beautiful Beijing in the English, but indeed actually beautiful China, or cultural gateway to China, to the nation in the Chinese. This is an image of the Beijing Fine Art Academy. And you will notice immediately that what they are doing is copying furiously ancient Greek sculptures. Now, I particularly like the plastic bag in the front of this image, which gives you the impression that this is just a quick snapshot that's been taken on someone's phone. But as any of you who are familiar with China know, there's absolutely nothing kind of left to chance in this kind of image that is represented at Beijing Airport for everyone to see as they arrive into the country. Now, what's interesting is that this image is by no means isolated. And in fact, it speaks to an ever deepening connection between Greece and China offering Greece the opportunity to pivot away from its somewhat unappreciating Western European companions towards the east. Now, this journey began, I think, back in 2014 with direct flights being set up, pre-COVID obviously, between Athens and Shanghai and Beijing. It's been continued on a cultural level through exchange exhibitions between the Acropolis Museum, Shanghai Museum, and most recently exhibition spaces within the Forbidden City in Beijing, where each culture has sent their premier artifacts to one another. It was compounded, for instance, in September 2018 by a meeting of 30 different Chinese institutions in Athens, in which the Dean of the Academy for International Communication of Chinese Culture from Beijing Normal University commented, "Both countries exerted great influence on the development of the world civilization, and the meeting of these two civilizations in the 21st century can help mankind." Now, there's three main reasons for this interest, particularly from China towards Greece, and indeed Greece towards China. I think from the Chinese perspective, they want to make clear that anything we can understand and do in the West, they can understand too in the East. To equivalate that their pasts are just as good and just as important as ours, particularly Han and Chinese and Greek culture, but also, of course, it links to this. China's Belt and Road, a one belt, one road foreign policy, in which the Piraeus port in Athens is, as we well know, a major player. In August 2018, a memorandum of understanding between Greece and China on the Belt and Road Initiative was signed, at which a foreign ministry spokesperson said this: "As an important meeting point of the land Silk Road and the maritime Silk Road, Greece is China's natural partner in the construction of our new Belt and Road." And the Piraeus is seen very much as the dragonhead of China's Belt and Road Initiative. This has been supplemented since 2017 by the Ancient Civilizations Forum. This was constructed initially between Greece and China, but now involves the following members. It's quite a crew: Greece, China, Bolivia, Egypt, Iraq, Iran, Italy, Peru, and now Armenia. And as you can see there, their three major aims are not just to bring to our modern attention the importance of the ancient civilizations which these modern countries are home to, but also to use civilization as soft and smart power, and in turn to use it as an agent of economic growth and development. And we saw that most recently in November 2019, when Premier Xi Jinping undertook a trip to Greece, in which he hailed a new chapter of decisive importance in relations of Greece and China, with Greece as China's gateway to Europe. 16 trade deals were signed, and both spoke of the fact that both ancient civilizations now should join hands to deliver greater benefits to our peoples in the modern world. So just as Greece's perception and experience of a much bigger global ancient world in antiquity was more sophisticated and important than I think the traditional Mediterranean perspectives at first allow, so too I would argue that the view from the Aegean in the 21st century is one which is increasingly global and increasingly looking east. Something I think that European partners and nations would do well to take more seriously. Thank you very much indeed for your attention this evening, and I very much look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very, very much, Michael. We live in an era of the novel coronavirus, and you've certainly delivered a novel perspective on ancient Greece, and delivered it with extraordinary enthusiasm and vigour. And very nicely brought it home to the modern contemporary world. We have a number of questions already. I'll abuse my position as chair, as it were, to ask you what I think is quite a simple question, but just to start us thinking about it. How much of what you described just now would have been possible without the Hellenistic expansion, the Alexander's conquests and the successors and so on, and that sort of push out towards the east?
That period, of course, was incredibly important for tying together, I think, the Mediterranean world with those empires, which had been the Achaemenid Empire, of course, coming the Parthian. And we can see examples of interaction that date back all the way to Greek architects working at building Persepolis, for instance. But with Alexander's expansion, creating that part of sort of one big, if very briefly connected world, we see an expansion of Greek culture and ideas and myths that are still very much referred to and kind of part and parcel several centuries later of the way that people now operating and ruling in those areas try to link themselves back to the Mediterranean. I think that in that sense, the way that the Saca king Azes knows enough to sort of want to utilize the conception of the idea of Alexander the Great and the relationship Alexander the Great created with Indian kings as part of his renewed endeavor to become an ally of now the Roman emperor is particularly instructive there.
Okay, so first question that's come up on the screen. You don't mention the Greeks of Bactria. What contact did the homeland have with them?
So this is an interesting point, and it's a very difficult and knotty problem as you get into the sort of study of the Silk Roads. When you're talking about the Greeks, who are you talking about? I've tried to sort of say very much this evening that this is the view from the Aegean, and tried to link that into Greeks, if they're further afield, that we think may have actually come from, if you like, the heartland of Greece itself, the Roman provinces of Achaia, Prof, and Macedonia. But of course, there would be people thinking of themselves to different degrees as Greek, or at least influenced by the Greek, moving all the way through into Central Asia and indeed to Bactria, Greco-Bactria, before, of course, that became part of a whole different series of worlds. And by the 1st century CE, Greco-Bactria is actually probably part of the Kushan Empire. The Kushans themselves are one of the migrating nomadic tribes, the Yuezhi, who have actually come from the steppe area sort of to the northwest of China and have been sort of pushed into their migratory move by the other great nomadic tribe that was so problematic for Han China, the Xiongnu. So these Yuezhi have migrated westwards, downwards, and then morphed into the sedentary empire of the Kushans. And we see in their material culture, places like Tilla Tepe, for instance, that kind of smorgasbord of different cultural influences of the items they're using. So again, within this time period that I've sort of fixated on this evening of the sort of end of the 1st century BCE through to the mid-2nd century CE, we can see lots of Greek culture about, and people across that whole area, geographical region in Central Asia that may have, to some extent, thought of themselves as Greeks. But I've tried to focus very much kind of what did the Greeks back at home think and understand about all of this.
A question about shipping technology. How did shipping technology change? And did this affect the extent of these extra Aegean networks?
I think that, we read in the text, the very famous the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, that it was kind of in the early 1st century CE that Roman traders worked out or found out how to not necessarily develop their tech, but actually to sail, for example, with the monsoon winds all the way across the open ocean to India, and then to sail back with the winds and do that sort of round trip within a passable time. Now, we're told that actually this was something that was known about, for instance, by the Arabian traders for quite a while before that. But clearly in this sort of competitive market, it wasn't the sort of knowledge that they necessarily passed on. But I think kind of once that kind of knowledge is developed, we're already talking about a pretty sophisticated sea trading community. You have all the, if you like, the tech and the ship engineering knowledge they need to be able to take advantage of it. And what really has to catch up, and we hear about this again in the sources and in some of the surviving actual inscriptional sources, is the sort of financing of these long range voyages. They were incredibly expensive to sort of put together, but the payoff, if the ship made it back, was huge. And so we hear of quite sophisticated financing of these ventures, loans, the maritime loans, etc., that are happening out of the ports of Berenice, etc., and Myosiomos in Egypt, to be able to kind of finance these expeditions.
Thank you. A couple of questions related to the Roman period. First of all, does the iconography of Augustus on the coinage in and beyond the Aegean vary?
I would, as in this bow to people who are more expert in the coinage of Augustus than I am. What we do know is that kind of his image varies, both in statuary, and the coinage varies and develops and has certain sort of epochs, if you like, of his rule. But if we think about, for example, the very famous Meroe head of Augustus, that is in the British Museum, kind of what we look at there, a head that ended up being taken out of Egypt and sort of down to the kingdom of Meroe and then sort of buried underfoot, to give an example of where the Romans were not militarily successful. Well, the head we look at there of Augustus is one that we would instantly recognize from any of his more central Mediterranean Italian statues and coinage. So I would sort of say, no, as far as my understanding goes, that Augustus's portrait, both in coinage and in statuary, while going through minor refinements and subtle evolutions over time, does not change dramatically wherever we go within his reach.
Question about the foundations, if you like, of the Roman Empire. Is it safe to say that the Roman Empire we know today, as well as many others, would not be so culturally developed without Greece? That's a very broad question.
Well, I mean, that picks up the Horace quote with which I started, doesn't it? The sort of famous idea that Greece, while captured militarily, actually turned around and captured its uncouth, its rude, its sort of uneducated conqueror, bringing the arts over to rustic Latium. And to the extent kind of that we buy into that, we know it may well have happened in multiple forms. Rome didn't come into contact with Greek culture only when it militarily conquered Greece. Of course, the Greeks were in southern Italy and Sicily from the colonial expansion of the 8th to the 6th centuries BCE. And so Greece came into contact Rome came into contact with Greek culture very much primarily when it expanded within Italy itself to take over these sites. And it's through these places that, for instance, we see perhaps Greek drama, Greek theatre, the idea of theatre and conception of theatre first entering into the Roman bloodstream. Once Rome has military conquest of Greece, Greece does develop, as we sort of alluded to through the talk, this sense of its place as this finishing school, rhetorical and philosophical finishing school, particularly in Athens. And we know that the Greeks of the Roman period responded to this perception by the Romans as a place to come, as a sort of a certain amount of a Disneyland. In Sparta, for instance, at the sanctuary of Artemis or Thea, we see in the sanctuary the development and building of a sort of large bank of stadium seats around the altar and temple of this sanctuary, specifically in the Roman period, in order to accommodate Roman tourists coming to witness what they were told was an absolutely age-old ritual for Spartan warrior men. That was to sort of prostrate themselves over the altar and be whipped, for which there is absolutely no evidence of such a ceremony having occurred in kind of archaic and classical times. So we see there examples where Greece was playing up to its role that it was offering to particularly its Roman audience.
The following questioner thanks you for an inspiring talk, and then asks what you think about world systems analysis applied to the ancient world. Can we talk of a center-periphery relationship on the early Silk Road?
I think this is a really interesting one, and the models that we might want to use for understanding how the Silk Road network came into being, I think we're at the very, very early stages of actually getting our heads around this. It's an interesting one that sort of falls between the gaps of scholarship. Silk Road scholars are most normally not classicists. They're normally coming out of studies of departments of Byzantine studies, for instance, or the later periods. They are therefore chronologically, traditionally interested in the period by which time the Silk Roads are fully operating, formed, and in full flood. Equally, the sort of period before that, so the period up to, say, the 4th century CE, the period normally looked at by sort of classicists, we are, to a certain extent, kind of reluctant or kind of don't often take the opportunity to see how the Mediterranean worlds connect into these burgeoning and developing networks through Central Asia into China. So I think we need to sort of put our focus a bit more on this nascent period of Silk Roads when these connections are being grown and understand better the potential models for how they develop. I would imagine that we have to use quite a significant and sophisticated sort of network analysis approach, where we're seeing lots of different hubs emerging, dependent on the very frequently changing political and military conditions that are both encouraging and inhibiting trade moving via particular routes. And we know of examples, for instance, whereby kind of when blocked via one route for one particular moment in time because of particular political and military problems, actually then, like the sort of flow of water around a block, the trade finds another route. But we also hear in the Chinese sources in this early period, for instance, in the early Han period, of goods having made their way through via routes that simply cannot be discovered, even by the emperor when he sends out official search parties to kind of document the routes by which these goods are moving, and yet they're somehow getting out and through. So even to the ancients themselves, the networks and hubs through which goods began to move in the early phases of the Silk Roads were something of a mystery.
Question about the identity of the people actually involved in financing and undertaking the long distance trade you described. What do we know about the identity of those people?
So it seems to have been very much a mix, and sometimes we know more simply because of the survival of evidence in one particular area. So we are getting quite a lot of information coming out of Egypt and the ports of Via Egnatia. So we have, for example, the survival of the Mezieris papyrus relating to one particular financing of one particular voyage going to the Indian port of Mezieris, which was sort of on the southern western coast of India. So we get that kind of sense of these people who are almost specializing in financing this kind of wealth. But the sort of values, the monetary values that things like the Mezieris papyrus are talking about really help us understand and put the potentiality of this trade in context. The total amounts that possibly could come out of such a successful voyage are putting people well within the sort of bands that one were expected to have of wealth to be able to take part in the senior levels of Roman government, to be in the Senate, for example, and the sort of property and financial qualification that one needed for that. So these were mega wealth-making possibilities, both for those that were in the right part of the world, particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean, to take advantage of.
Is there evidence for ancient Greeks interacting with Northern European areas, or Northern European areas, I should say?
I mean, I think this is something that we are increasingly discovering as we're looking for this kind of evidence and seeing these not just east-west trade corridors that we so often now begin to talk about, but actually the north-south trade corridor from the Mediterranean up into the Baltic. I think just a couple of weeks ago, for instance, not necessarily a piece of Greek evidence, Greek interaction, but it was reported that in graves up in Scandinavia, in the Baltic area, there had been found examples of Roman board games and Roman pieces in which kind of dating to, I think, the 1st or 2nd century CE, which indicates that kind of the interaction between the Roman world, Mediterranean and the Baltic and Scandinavian countries is probably much more developed than we might initially imagine.
Sorry, I'm reading the wrong one. Is there a difference in experience and in written record between Periplus and Periegesis, I think it is? And do you feel that sea travel in that period was somehow lesser than land travel?
I think it had a very different, I think it's a very interesting question. I think it had a very different conception and potentiality to it. I mean, the sea travel obviously is a long-term part of Mediterranean culture, but it came with it certain particular dangers and certain particular possibilities of it going very wrong, with that kind of ultimately not longed for death, which was to perish at sea, ending up with your body being eaten by the fishes and not being buried and being given the proper funerary rites. And we see this as a constant refrain of the worry of being put to sea, and that sort of actually a career doing this was considered it's not quite the last possible resort and sort of the worst possible thing you could end up doing, but it's certainly not at the top of your list. In contrast to that, land movement, of course, was a kind of much more tried and tested, and in some ways thought to be a safer way of doing things. The sorts of knowledge that is gained through each kind of travel, I think, is also quite interestingly different. What people are doing if they're sailing to these places is very often being motivated principally by trade. And as a result, the kind of interest and the engagement and the locations that they make for are these trading emporia that we then hear about, for instance, in India. Land discovery could have a lot more different implications as to what is its final goal, whether it could be trade, but also it could be a political alliance, it could be military conquest. So I think there are sort of different, a range of different things that people are searching for through these two different methods of travel, which again colour the sorts of information that we end up hearing about. And alongside that, particularly when we start to think about the longer range connections through the Silk Road, obviously sea travel was the same group of people going over much further distances to make that return journey. Whereas, as I said, kind of with the land routes, actually these tended to be much more kind of travelers and traders operating over a set defined distance that they move backwards and forwards in, rather than contemplating the much longer distances that we hear as the occasional exception people like Menis was able to achieve.
The next questioner wonders about the economic aspect of this. Long distance trade made some people extremely rich. Despite Greece's involvement, not a lot of this seems to have stayed with the Greek elite, as far as this person can tell. There were clearly a few families who could keep up with the imperial elite, but the wealth seems to have gone elsewhere. Any thoughts on this? Also, perhaps with cynical modern parallels?
Well, I mean, the Romans did have a very effective system, and it was typically Roman in the sense that it was focused around light touch governance. Let the market get on with it as much as possible, rather than us invest the time and effort in doing it. So, for instance, the trading vessels that set out from Egypt across the Indian Ocean and came back again, they were all private ventures who were then taxed on several different occasions as the goods came into Egypt, moved up through Egypt, and then left Egypt to go to the Mediterranean by the Roman authorities, taking their cut at that point. And one has to imagine, I think, similar models for the trade that emerged via the land routes, either coming through to places like Tyre and Antioch on the eastern Mediterranean coast, or indeed coming north via the Caspian Sea, Black Sea, and then down through the Aegean and coming through into Corinth, and kind of the sort of taxation that would have gone on there as well. So I think you're right that we don't hear necessarily of Greece kind of benefiting entirely, just as many other parts of the Roman Empire didn't benefit entirely from the wealth that they were seeing go past them. But we do hear about people who turned to Greece to benefit. I mean, the example, for instance, of one wealthy person at some point in, I think it was in the late 1st century, early 2nd century CE, buying back the island of Salamis for Athens, that it had sort of had to lease off at a moment of its own kind of financial economic downturn, sort of being bought back for it. Of course, alongside all the beautification of the major Greek cities that was done for them by Roman emperors and their lieutenants.
Quite simple question, but might take a long time to answer. So probably you might have a simple way of finding this out. But can you tell us more about how the Orbis program works? maybe the simplest thing there is to go to the website and explore it.
I think that might be the case. I mean, I find it something that's very, very worth keep coming back to, because it gives us the most up-to-date model based on the seasons that you're sailing. So you can change your time of year that you're sailing, change the routes that you're preferring to travel by, going between different parts of the Roman world, in order to really get a sense about how far away things were from one another. And I think it's that real world experience, that sort of on the ground experience, rather than simply always looking at it sort of from the bird's eye view, as it were, that I think is very important for us to kind of keep factoring in. I would, if I could put a plea, if anyone from the Stanford Geospatial Modeling Group is listening in or hears this lecture in the future, that they move to try and create a bigger orbis, an oikoumene orbis, which actually covers the Silk Road network as we know it, because I think that would be equally of extraordinary importance, to try and just get a conception of how often it took goods and indeed people to move across these networks.
Question for someone about exhibitions, and whether you're aware of any displays or exhibitions in the UK or elsewhere that have explored the kinds of links we've been talking about this evening.
I'm not, well, particularly with COVID-19, I'm not particularly aware of any exhibitions that are planning to open up any time soon, although it is, I think now, confirmed that the British Museum in the next couple of years will be doing something focused almost exclusively on the Silk Roads. I think this is becoming, not least because, as we mentioned at the end of the talk, of China's One Belt, One Road policy and more recent interest in the Silk Roads, an increasingly kind of important topic to start getting our heads around. I think it's particularly kind of interesting that in Greece we're seeing more of this exchange and a museum exhibition space of kind of foreign cultures, particularly Chinese culture, particularly Han culture. And in China, what's fascinating is that this is not just a political act of kind of cultural appreciation, but it's one that seems to have a wide public resonance. The exhibitions of ancient Greek artifacts took place in Shanghai that I saw some of in 2018 were absolute sellout successes, with people queuing around the block to be able to engage with them. They were accompanied by new volumes that were that many scholars which were listening and involved with the BSA, I think, were asked to contribute to, writing pieces about ancient Greek culture that were then kind of brought into very, very glossy sort of, you know, coffee table kind of books that have been selling well within Greece, within China itself. So I think we're seeing, particularly there, an interest which is going far beyond simply the realms of kind of political, economic and financial linkage.
Here's a controversial one. How would you respond to the criticism that the idea of global ancient history is merely a passing fashion that seeks somehow artificially to find origins of our contemporary globalized world in antiquity?
I think it's an issue that global history, or indeed kind of world history as it's sometimes called, has to reflect on and respond to. I came to it and got interested in this more global perspective because every time I worked on a particular sanctuary or a particular place within the Greek world, I would often come across some interaction and engagement and arrival of peoples coming from outside the traditional sort of Mediterranean world, without which you couldn't really understand what was going on within these places. So the sort of boundary, I became increasingly frustrated with the sort of, what it felt to me was, of artificial boundaries of where we think about when we think about the Mediterranean world. And so that sent me off trying to look at how the Mediterranean world connected into particularly this emergent phase of wider global connection. To be honest, if you call it a fad, kind of potentially yes, but I think it is a particularly important fad for us to be engaging with. When I think about the students that I'm teaching, or kind of young researchers today, what element of the future can be certain for them, bar the onset of COVID-19, is one that is going to be an increasingly global. future. And institutions like the OECD that run PISA, the Programme for International Student Assessment, that looks at how curricula of different countries around the world are preparing school-aged students, so 15 plus, for the world that they will meet in the future. In 2018, PISA introduced a new criteria by which to measure those curricula, alongside literacy, numeracy, etc. They added the criterion of global competency. And this wasn't sort of how many languages could you speak, etc. It was how well prepared are we and our children and the people of the future for that ever increasing engagement with people who come from different cultural backgrounds and ideas. And I think that is something that we have to take seriously. And I think it is something that the ancient world has something to say to. Particularly because it is models of ancient interaction, like those of the ancient Silk Roads, that are being specifically called upon and mentioned as references and models for the increasing global connectivity today, particularly in the form of the One Belt, One Road.
Thanks. What do you think of the theory that Greek sculptors helped to design the terracotta army?
Yes, so I was referring to this, and particularly to the work of Lucas Nickel, isn't it, from the University of Vienna, who sort of made this argument in print, as well as it was an argument, I think, put forward in a BBC documentary not long ago. The jury is out. We simply don't have the evidence. What there is recognisably a leap forward in the artistic styles in Han China with the development of the terracotta army. But that leap forward, particularly in the kind of in the styling of life-size figurines, does not need yet to be answered by bringing the Greeks in from stage left to stage today. And I don't think there is the evidence yet to be able to support that we should particularly look to Greek ideas, sculptural ideas, travelling from sort of Central Asia east, over and above other potential places that those kind of sculpting and artistic influences could have come from. So I think it is an interesting and important area to continue to develop our understanding of what was happening and what was spreading in these very early phases of connectivity. But I don't necessarily think anytime soon we're going to be able to offer any kind of definitive answer to that question.
Question about philosophy. The influence of Indian philosophy and thought on Pyrrho is contested. Given these integrated trading routes, albeit in a later period, what are your thoughts about any potential Indian influence on Greek philosophy?
Well, I would bow to the superior knowledge, first off, of my philosophical colleagues. But again, this is part and parcel of a bigger picture in which we are now looking for the connective influences of this connections between different cultures, both within and outside the Mediterranean, ever further back in time. So not simply referring to the period that I'm talking about this evening in the 1st century CE and onward, but actually going further back indeed than Alexander the Great, the 4th century BC, but going back all the way to the eras of the creation of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And the epic tradition that gave rise to the Odyssey, and seeing there, as many scholars have noted, the cultural similarities and storyline similarities between the epics that emerged in the Mediterranean and the major Indian epics of that time, the Brahmabharata, for example. And I think that would also kind of should be expanded to think about the philosophical kind of overlaps and potential influences as well. So I think this is not simply a question that comes up once you have the emerging Silk Roads. Actually, this is a question that we should be asking ourselves about all eras of study within the Mediterranean world. And I know, John, that we were talking earlier, weren't we, about PhDs recently that have been done that are thinking very much more about this early period of connectivity. And the work that I've been looking at most recently about silk, for instance, and the spread of silk, obviously famously with the Silk Road, but some of the earliest, the most interesting kind of recent evidence for that is the very early presence of silk remains much, much earlier than we had hitherto anticipated, coming into the Mediterranean world. So I think the story of the earliest phases of interaction between the Mediterranean and the World Worlds are still very much to be discovered.
I think you've just answered another question which we had, which was, do you see any potentials in researching further in contact between Greece and China in the pre-Silk Road period? So I think we'll regard that one as answered. Apart from silk, so continuing this, do you find any other major Chinese imports in the Mediterranean?
We don't find remains of silk in the Mediterranean. I mean, one of the difficulties obviously is survival of material. So where we have most of our surviving silk examples from is actually coming from the grave, for instance, in Palmyra, where we have a wide range of surviving silks, which testify to the different ways in which they seem to have been imported and used. So kind of just to sort of focus on that material for a second, there are sort of over 30 surviving examples of silk from Palmyra that have Chinese writing on it. So kind of we have to imagine these Palmyrans walking around utilizing in some form silk material, indeed with a script on it, which was identified before, and whether they could possibly know what was written on or not is another guess. Equally, silk material with very recognizable Chinese emblems on that can be the parallels have been found through to the Tarim Basin in China itself. But equally, we find remains in Palmyra that have images on them which never appear within China. So we see examples of grape harvesting with camels, for instance, on surviving pieces of silk in Palmyra, which could be an example perhaps of something that's being woven over in the East specifically for a Central Asian market, or it could be an example of the sort of designs being created in that Central Asian market and then passed through to Palmyra. Other goods that we see coming in, we're kind of particularly thinking about China. We hear that Chinese iron, or at least what the Romans and the Mediterranean world thought was Chinese iron, was particularly well appreciated coming into the Mediterranean. And then, of course, from the we hear about a whole range of goods that the Romans were hoping to pick up through texts like the Periplus in the markets of India that were coming from a range of places in Central Asia and through to the east. And then, of course, from the Chinese sources, and thinking here of kind of some of the much later sources, but thinking about the chapters on the Western regions, etc., that very specifically, geographical area by geographical area, community by community, lists the kind of goods that you could particularly go after. And the Romans, or what we think of potentially as the Romans in the Chinese sources, Dacian, as they're referred to, were thought to sort of be particularly good place for pearl. The Chinese seem to have been under the impression that equally silk could come to China from the Roman world, but equally sort of a fireproof cloth was another famous thing that the Han Chinese thought that they could get from the Roman world. And that leads us to a sort of one of my favorite moments in the Chinese sources, one of the biggest perhaps misunderstandings in ancient history, which is in that mid-2nd century CE period, around about the 160s, when we hear in the Chinese sources that a group of Roman traders sort of blagged their way into the presence of the Chinese emperor, claimed to be there on a diplomatic mission from the Roman emperor, and present a series of goods that include things like tortoiseshell and sort of other very, very unremarkable and unimpressive goods that they probably just picked up in the local region. And the emperor's response to this is, oh, well, if this is the best that the Romans can do, maybe we really underestimate, or overestimated rather, quite how amazing this place is. And frankly, is it worth us trying to get there from now on? Possibly not. So it kind of on potentially these moments of misunderstanding did history turn.
Question about your terminology. What do you mean by worlds? Is it something like the Braudelian monde as distinct integrated totalities, or something more like, quote, archaic globalizations?
I'm not particularly hugely wedded to sort of being strictly within either of those interpretations, principally because I think they are so continually within this world that I'm talking about, or sort of area that I'm talking about across the Silk Road network, so incredibly flexible and ever changing and change dependent on which perspective you're looking at. Are we thinking about a world from the material culture perspective of where one could recognizably see, for instance, Greek ideas or Greek myths or Greek culture, material culture? Are we thinking about it as a physical world of kind of how and to what extent Greeks moved about this arena? Are we thinking about it from the perspective of Greek ideas being useful to communicate with and through across this vast expanse? So I think, as far as my understanding goes of how we need to approach this sort of bigger canvas of what I would call the sort of global ancient world, so the kind of through the Silk Road net, connected by the Silk Road networks, we need to be much more flexible and responsive to the particular perspectives the different groups had at any point on this geographical space, and at the particular time that we're talking about, and from the particular perspective that we want to understand their experience, be it material culture, be it politics, be it religion, be it physical movement.
Question about Strabo. Was his marginalization of Greece part of a wider Roman political and cultural agenda to big up Rome at the expense of Greece and its cultural, political achievements, etc., i.e. to de-emphasize the Greek basis of Roman achievement?
I think it's interesting. I think Strabo plays, obviously writing in the 1st century CE, we have to put him into the context of all those other great works that are coming forward in the 1st century CE, particularly bolstering and setting up the idea of a Roman Empire, fairly recent kind of mention, as the kind of ultimate inevitable destination where we've all been traveling to over the last couple of 100 years. But I think Strabo, when you read him kind of closely, is actually constantly sort of playing with that idea, possibly more so than I sort of allowed him to at the beginning of this talk as I set up his view of Greece. I mean, one of the things, for instance, when he talks about Rome, is that on the one hand, of course, he does bang on about how important and amazing and wonderful and central to everything Rome is, and how it's been particularly well set up and it's got everything it needs to be a real world dominator. But he also talks about the foundation of Rome and offers up a story in which the foundation of Rome, yes, kind of, Romulus and Remus, fine. But have you heard the story in which actually it was founded by Greeks? Now, he then sort of, in a very kind of Herodotean fashion, sort of falls back from that and said, there are people who believe these sort of tales about Rome without entirely committing himself to them. So he's constantly giving and taking, both in terms of how he thinks about Rome and sets up Rome, but equally how he sets up Greece. I think one of the interesting things about his particular decision to, as I put it, marginalize Greece as a part of Europe and delay getting to Greece until he's been to Byzantium and then come back to Greece, thus Greece being in books 8 or 9 of the geography. The corollary of that, the other side of that, is that actually Greece ends up being at the very center and a midway point of his narrative of the whole oikoumene. And that's irrespective of whether you count or not the sort of final books to be definitively part of his original work. So there's, again, always the two sides to the way that Strabo is representing the different parts, constituent parts of his ancient world.
Do we see a decline in long-distance trade in the years following the 2nd century CE, notably after the 3rd century and the later Roman period?
Well, yes, we do. And what I should say is, first off, and very relevant to today with COVID-19, is that we can actually track the implications of the plague, the Antonine plague of the 2nd century CE, which sweeps through, potentially coming, of course, from the East, a sort of early global pandemic, which seems to have had a very severe impact on those trading networks. If we go back to Palmyra, for instance, and we look at the evidence provided by the honorific inscriptions thanking traders and particularly sort of the money men and the muscle men who helped protect the trading caravans as they moved across the desert, we see a real slowdown in those honorific inscriptions, and thus we must imagine the trade from the 160s to about the 190s CE. And it's only really after the 190s that things start to pick up again. Obviously, Palmyra's story will end in the 3rd century CE as Palmyra ends up getting destroyed by the Romans when sort of under Zenobia it decides to sort of go against the Roman world. And we do see again something of a slowdown and as part of the traditional story of the kind of economic crisis that beset the Romans in the 3rd century CE. But then, actually, once we get into the 4th century CE and the traditional turf, if you like, of Silk Road scholars, and for us, kind of thinking around the Mediterranean of Byzantine scholars, the pace of trade only again picks up to be influenced again by times like Justinian played, but it really sort of kicks off and moves forward and builds, and the Silk Road networks continue to be the integral kind of economic arteries affecting the outcomes of all the communities living across that road, right through until 15th century and the discovery of the sea routes that sort of take you around kind of and sort of the Horn of Africa and through to the east, and thus negating the necessity for a land-based route.
Slightly related question, do we know about the use of river travel with regards to the Caspian trade route via Dioscurias? For example, this questioner has heard about a putative trade route along the Oxus before it was diverted into the Aral Sea, and also the use of Caucasian river systems for trade in the Bronze Age, and is wondering if there was evidence for this in the classical period.
I mean, I think undoubtedly we have to imagine these river networks being an important part of how stuff was moved around. I mean, Dioscurias, you know, as investigated by Pompey and moving up through, you know, supposedly was also the place that you could see the anchor of the Argo, kind of that was on display there as well. I mean, again, if we bring it back to the sort of the rivers that so often feature in this particular part of the world, thinking about the Euphrates and the Tigris, that the model of movement of goods when Palmyra was at its heyday seems to be sort of moving the goods going west. Sorry, if the goods are going east, so coming into Palmyra and then heading east, they sort of cut across the desert, getting to the river, to the Euphrates as quickly as they can, then putting those goods on riverboats to be guided down the Euphrates until you emerge into the sea, where thereby they'd then be transferred into ocean-bound vessels heading off to the ports of India. And we know that Palmyrines were stationed at all points on that network, down to where it emerged into the sea at a place called Spasinu-Sharax, operating those networks. And then on the way back, either coming, it wasn't possible to go so easily back up river as far. So they would journey up river when the goods were sort of coming from the east and going west as far as they could, then putting them on land and having to do a much longer and potentially more dangerous desert crossing to get back to Palmyra. So kind of definitely the rivers are integral to the picture of how trade is being moved, I think, in any era that we would care to look at and examine.
Michael, this is turning into a veritable marathon of questions. There are a few more. Can you bear it?
Absolutely. Pleasure.
Absolutely. Okay. It's slightly related to the previous question, not the most recent question. How did the transition from the Seleucid Empire to the Parthian Kingdom alter the system of global networks that you have described?
Fundamentally, it's part of this story of rupture, discontinuity, and then redevelopment in a new form. So the Seleucid Empire, the story of the disintegration of the Seleucid Empire is a sort of not an overnight thing to be replaced by the Parthians. As many people will be familiar, the sort of Seleucid Empire, the sort of baggy entity, both collapses and then re-expands and collapses again as different communities break away from it. So those Greco-Bactrians broke away from it for independence fairly early on, as did the constituent part of it, the Parthian community, and then the Parthians start to develop and expand and control and create their own empire. Now, of course, once you've got the Parthians kind of facing off against the developing kind of power base in the Mediterranean and the Roman world, by the 1st century CE, that's fairly kind of set in stone. We do sense the fact that the Parthians are keen to make sure that they benefit from the trading networks that are inevitably crossing their boundaries. I think it's an interesting thing that despite the constant on-off geopolitical and military conflict between the Romans and the Parthians, actual trade that we know, the goods that we know to have been moving across this boundary of empires, actually seems to carry on fairly undisturbed. The local networks moving out of places like Palmyra, but equally coming from the Parthian side in places like Seleucia, we saw, and working down the Euphrates River and hopping backwards and forwards between the two communities, really operated in this kind of little local bubble where people were moving across these worlds without too much difficulty. We see in the Palmyrian honorific inscriptions them honouring people who are Parthians, who are living and working in Parthian towns like Augustus. We hear about Roman temples being erected kind of in Parthian towns on this boundary line. And at the same time, we hear from the Chinese sources that the Parthians may well have been doing everything they can to hang on to their very lucrative, no doubt, role as middlemen for these goods that were coming from the east and moving through to the west and vice versa. So in the Chinese sources, we hear about repeated attempts through the first, particularly through the first and early and second century CE, for Chinese emissaries and groups to try and make it through to physically get to Dachin, to the Roman world. And they are specifically put off by the Parthians, who are referred to in the Chinese sources as the Anshi, who claim things like, oh no, it's years and years to be able from here to be able to get on to the Roman world and Mediterranean world. Don't you worry about making the journey yourself. We'll continue to do it for you. And the Chinese seem perfectly well aware that the Anchi are frustrating their attempts to have direct contact in order to preserve their position as middlemen. So I think there we have an example whereby the creation of a very different kind of entity, Parthians, that do see themselves in some kind of competition and disjuncture from the Roman world, led to different kinds of trading engagement than perhaps we would have seen, or in fact did see, when that part of Asia, leading into Central Asia, was more part of the Mediterranean world under the Seleucids.
More questions, appropriately one ancient and one modern. You talked about how Mace might have actually met with the Han Dynasty through the ancient Silk Road. And this questioner is curious, were there more possible interactions between the Mediterranean world and the ancient Chinese civilization apart from trade?
So no, it is very, very, very occasionally that we hear about these connections. And I must emphasize that we are bringing together two separate sets of sources in Mace and sort of trying to make them correlate in a way that we can never possibly prove. And I think it speaks to that there were very small windows of time when it would have been possible, because of political and military détente, for people to travel over that much, much wider distance, moving from the Mediterranean through to China. We heard about the case of Maes, potentially his agents around 100 CE. We heard about the case of Roman traders coming up really from sort of area of modern day Vietnam to kind of meet with the Chinese emperor in the 160s CE and representing themselves as having come from the Roman emperor, but in reality probably being just being part of the kind of developing trading networks of that region. And then as we get into the 3rd century CE, we hear potentially more about these direct connections happening via ship. And from there on, kind of the things develop from there.
And the final question, in which way do you think we could make a correlation between the position of Athens and Piraeus in the 21st century Silk Road and the position of the big Western cities like London in the 21st century tech roads? And to clarify, the questioner says they're thinking about the preference of Eastern students for the big universities of the West, in contrast with the picture you showed in the Beijing airport and the lack of Eastern students in Greek universities.
Wow, I think this is a very, very big question, isn't it? I mean, I think from my understanding of the Chinese perspective, what's been happening is a gradual and engaging development with the stories of ancient Mediterranean history in China. I mean, I think there are something like now about 100 Chinese academics in Chinese institutions studying the ancient Greek, Roman, and associated Mediterranean worlds. And the Institute for the History of Ancient Civilizations that I was a visiting fellow at really is the sort of still the pioneer in that, having been set up back in 1986. In terms of kind of where students want to position themselves in a kind of developing economic world versus the tech world, I mean, I would defer to those who know more about the tech industry than I do in the 21st century. But it strikes me that on the tech side of things, and particularly in terms of technological connectivity in the 21st century, there are still advantages to studying, learning, and engaging with that within the West. You know, we've all heard the stories about the way in which WeChat is policed kind of within China, and the ability for kind of digital communication to continue in a not particularly unfettered manner within China itself. So I can perhaps understand the desire to have that greater exposure and wanting to place oneself outside of the East for that kind of experience and exposure. In terms of economic development, I think the figures speak for themselves. You know, the Piraeus has gone from something like the 98th most busy port in the world to now something like, please correct me if I'm wrong, the 36th so busiest port in the world. So it's seen massive increases since the beginning of sort of the period of Chinese investment. And I think it is part of an extremely clever appropriation of China to make a bid for Greece's interest, favour and friendship via the connection between their ancient cultures, in essence using something which we have traditionally in the West seen as the font of our culture as the very means by which it creates its own links through to Europe, and through which it encourages Greece to look eastwards into the future. And of course, it's not just with Greece that China is playing this game, but it strikes me as a very smart one indeed, and one which, frankly, we haven't yet woken up to thinking about how we are responding to.